The wealthy often believe money gives them the power to measure others. One millionaire thought he could stage a cruel test, collapsing in front of his longtime black employee's daughter, expecting her to fail, expecting her humanity to be outweighed by resentment. But in that single moment, when life and prejudice collided, he discovered something that would forever haunt him and change him. This is not just about wealth or status. It's about the dangerous arrogance of racism and the shocking truth that can only be revealed when masks of superiority are stripped away. Richard Callahan was a self-made millionaire, at least that's what he told anyone who would listen. Owner of a successful construction empire, he had built his reputation on being tough but fair. Yet, behind closed doors, Richard's fairness often had sharp limits. His employees of color, especially black workers, noticed the subtle ways he held them back: slower promotions, constant suspicion, and an unspoken ceiling they could never quite break through. Among his longest-serving employees was Samuel Johnson, a quiet, diligent man who had worked for Richard for over 2 decades. Samuel never complained, but those who knew him whispered about the way he was overlooked time and again for leadership roles. Richard often dismissed him as reliable but not leadership material. Samuel's daughter, Maya, had just graduated nursing school and often stopped by her father's workplace. She carried herself with grace and ambition, eager to step into a world that, she hoped, would see her for her skills rather than her skin. To Richard, however, she was just the kid of one of my workers. Then came the day Richard decided to stage his test. He told himself it was harmless, just a way to confirm his suspicions. Deep down, however, it was fueled by the racist stereotype he had nurtured his whole life, that people like Maya and her father lacked the compassion and integrity he claimed to value most. So Richard planned a cruel experiment. In front of Maya, he would collapse, clutch his chest, and watch. Would she freeze? Would she walk away? Or would she prove him right, in all the wrong ways? The day was ordinary, at least on the surface. Richard had invited Samuel and Maya to a small luncheon at his private estate, disguised as a gesture of gratitude for Samuel's years of service. The dining room was immaculate: crystal glasses, silver cutlery, chandeliers glistening in the afternoon light. Maya noticed the stiffness in the air from the moment they arrived. Her father, humble and soft-spoken, seemed uncomfortable in the lavish setting. Richard, on the other hand, wore his arrogance like a tailored suit. He asked about Maya's plans, but not with genuine interest. His questions were loaded, laced with disbelief that she had chosen nursing, as though such a profession was beneath the daughter of a man he considered just labor. The conversation dragged, until Richard finally leaned back, clutching his chest. His face twisted, his hand trembled, and he slumped to the floor. Samuel shouted in panic, rushing toward his boss, but Richard's eyes, half open, darting, betrayed the act. He was watching Maya, measuring her, waiting to see if she would stumble, if she would prove his prejudices true. But Maya didn't hesitate. The moment Richard hit the ground, she dropped her purse, checked his pulse, and began swift, precise compressions. Her voice rang steady, authoritative, as she instructed her father to call emergency services. Every movement reflected her training, her discipline, her heart. Minutes stretched into what felt like eternity. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she kept pressure, whispering encouragements to a man she knew had never respected her family. She wasn't thinking about racism. She wasn't thinking about how Richard looked at her. She was only thinking of saving a life. And then Richard suddenly sat up, gasping, not from a heart attack, but from the weight of his own shame. His cruel experiment had been shattered by the very compassion he doubted. He had expected indifference, maybe even bitterness. What he received instead was grace under fire. But Maya's eyes told the fuller story. She wasn't relieved for him. She wasn't smiling. Her gaze was sharp, steady, and filled with disappointment. Not because she thought he had truly been dying, but because she knew. She knew the collapse was staged. She knew she had been tested, like an object of suspicion, not a human being. And in that moment, Richard realized he had exposed not Maya's character, but his own. Silence gripped the room. Samuel stood frozen, his phone still in hand, torn between shock and humiliation. Maya slowly rose to her feet, her breathing heavy, her hands trembling from the exertion of saving a man who didn't need saving. Richard's facade crumbled. His eyes darted away, unable to meet hers. He muttered something about just wanting to see how she'd react, but the words fell flat, poisoned by their own cruelty. For years, he had prided himself on control of his business, control of his employees, control of the narrative that made him the benevolent, self-made millionaire. But in this instant, control slipped from his grasp. Maya had revealed him for what he was, a man so blinded by prejudice that he would fake death to confirm his own lies. The weight of the truth pressed on him heavier than any real heart attack could. He saw Samuel's quiet pain, the humiliation of watching his daughter's humanity put on trial. He saw Maya's strength, not only in her medical skills, but in her dignity, her refusal to break under his gaze. Richard had intended the moment to be a test. Instead, it became his undoing. The arrogance that had built his empire now stood exposed, fragile, and shameful. The ambulance arrived minutes later, confused to find a man in perfect health. Samuel and Maya excused themselves quietly, their departure heavier than any words spoken. Richard remained alone in his mansion, surrounded by chandeliers and silver, yet feeling emptier than ever. In the days that followed, whispers spread among his employees. The story leaked not because Samuel told it, but because guilt has a way of echoing louder than silence. Richard's reputation began to shift, not as a tough but fair leader, but as a man who would go to degrading lengths to protect his prejudice. But the story didn't end with Richard. It ended with Maya. She returned to her work, not seeking revenge, not carrying bitterness, but holding on to the same compassion she had shown on that day. Her father's pride in her grew, not just for her skills as a nurse, but for her strength in standing tall against the ugliness of racism without losing her humanity. And Richard? He lived with the memory, the image of Maya saving him, eyes filled not with admiration, but with a truth he couldn't escape. That she was more than his prejudice, more than his cruel test, more than his wealth could ever measure. In the end, he realized that racism is not just about hate. Sometimes it's about the quiet, poisonous doubt that assumes the worst of others. And when that doubt is exposed, it leaves behind a mirror so sharp it cuts the one holding it. So the question remains, how many tests like Richard's are still being staged today, silently, invisibly, in boardrooms, classrooms, and daily life? And when they are, who will be revealed? The one being tested or the one doing the testing?